There was a time when women were walking around terrified that their uterus was either going to make them sick, crazy, or kill them. That is what we're going to talk about in today's video when we look at this diagnosis of the wandering womb. Hey everybody, I'm Juanita. Welcome to my very first video where I am going to talk about weird inventions, strange potions, and insane practices that women have had to suffer throughout history, all in the name of health. Now, if you're anything like me and you like to throw out weird, eclectic history facts in the middle of a girls' night conversation, then this channel is absolutely for you. But for now, we're going to delve deep into those secret places, and we're going to find out why this belief in this untamed, mysterious uterus led women to fear their bodies and use cinnamon and goat dung in order to treat it. Women have always been mysterious to men. Maybe it's our pheromones, our irresistible charms, or maybe it's just because we're so different and they're just curious as to what makes us tick. Men have been trying to figure us out since the beginning of time. They're still trying. So to really understand what the wandering womb is and how it still affects our lives today, we need to start by going back in time to Greece. Let's say around 400 BCE. Women weren't really allowed to practice medicine because, well, they were seen as inferior. The male physicians were the ones that studied the great writings of Aristotle and Socrates. Aristotle and Socrates may have been great thinkers, and we still use a lot of their philosophies as the foundation of our Western societies today. However, they did not think so highly of women. In fact, they thought that the male body was the perfect body and that women were just deformed or mutated males. I don't know if they thought that when we came out of the birth canal, we broke something off because we were seen as mentally inferior as well as physically inferior. It would have been impossible for us to comprehend anything as complicated as medicine, especially, being that there were 4 humors at the time. I could see how that would be overwhelming to a woman's brain. Anyway, this belief that women were physically and mentally inferior to men led to this cultural idea that the reason that women became sick with unexplained illnesses was because they had an organ that just didn't function properly, one that probably wasn't even necessary. I wonder what it could have been. If you guessed uterus, you're right. Even though men suffered from the same types of symptoms and illnesses that women did, the physicians would pin all of the women's ailments on the uterus. But luckily for the women of ancient Greece, they had the men there with their sharp observation skills and their impeccable critical thinking abilities so that they could tell the women how their own bodies worked. One of the most interesting diagnoses, the wandering womb. The physicians at the time really thought that our uteruses would detach from their placement and start wandering around in search for something. Women at the time lived in fear that their uterus may not be where it should be. Too high up into their ribs, they may experience sluggishness. Or they may feel like the world was spinning around because they could have episodes of vertigo. To the sides, it could affect the way that the liver or the spleen functions. It could possibly drop down. Then women could experience loss of speech, difficulty breathing, even sudden death. As late as the 16th century, more symptoms were being added. Basically, anything and everything that couldn't be explained was blamed on the uterus. If women wanted too much sex, their uterus must be wandering around. Didn't want sex enough, uterus must be wandering. Happy? Wandering uterus. Sad? Wandering uterus. Or if you were possessed by a demon or practiced witchcraft, it really wasn't your fault. You see, your uterus was wandering. These male physicians, being the men of science that they were, they wanted to know why the uterus wandered about. I'm curious myself. Galen, who was one of the most renowned Greek physicians, thought the uterus is probably an animal within an animal. And just as an animal gets hungry or tired or has its own ideas and feelings, so must the uterus. Women walked around thinking that their uterus was a wild animal. I think that this could probably lead to a lot of mental stress if you were a woman in ancient Greece. So you may wonder, what is it that your uterus would need that it would detach itself and wander around the body? Well, there are some explanations. Sometimes the uterus would be hungry. It would detach itself and wander around looking for more food. During that time of month, the uterus would start wandering around like a wounded animal trying to stop from bleeding. Because as we all know, bleeding was not a natural or normal thing. Men don't bleed once a month. One of the reasons that a uterus would wander around so much was because it was in desperate need of hydration. The hydration that the uterus craved was to be bathed in lots and lots of sperm. Of course it did. If you were really lucky, not only would you keep your uterus well hydrated, you would be pregnant all of the time. If you had a baby inside the uterus would stay anchored in one place because of the weight. I guess the wild animal of the uterus would calm down once it was heavy and full. I don't know about you, but I certainly get sleepy after I'm full. Back to the point. Whenever there was a diagnosis of a wandering womb, the first prescription was to go have lots of sex. I bet if we were to go back in time and ask those Greek women if being pumped full of semen actually helped their epileptic seizures, their headaches, or even their symptoms of vertigo, I bet the answer would be a resounding no. As you can imagine, some modern day scholars are looking back at this diagnosis of the wandering womb, and they're postulating that the reason that it was so common was because when you keep women interlocked in marriage and pregnant all the time and feeling inferior, it does serve political and social purposes to perpetuate this patriarchal system. It keeps women in their place. Once they figured out what was wrong with you and figured out why it was happening, like any good physician, they then wanted to treat the women. One of these common options was to bind the abdomen. The physicians would physically wrestle the uterus, which who knows what the heck they were doing in there. Like, what could they have been grabbing and moving around? Because clearly it wasn't really the uterus, but they thought it was the uterus. Anyway, they would put the uterus back in place and then they would wrap it with strips of material. I don't know how long they would have to keep these bindings on. Would it be for the rest of their lives, or would it just be until the uterus just gave up? But the treatment that I found to be the most interesting was called fumigation. Now remember, the thought was that the uterus was this wild animal living inside of women. So just like you would lure or repel an animal, the physicians thought that they would be able to do the same thing with the uterus. If your uterus was too low, the woman would lie down and around her head would be placed this wonderful potpourri of scents. Cinnamon, candles, fresh flowers, rose oils. All the while, her vagina was being blasted with horrible scents like burnt hair and goat dung. You thought I had forgotten about it, but I didn't. That's where it was. Near your vagina. What organ wants to smell goat dung instead of rose oil? None. So then the uterus would go upwards into its rightful position. But if your uterus was too high, the opposite happened. Your vagina would be treated to these wonderful scents. The goat dung would be placed around your head. Fumigations like this, just like the idea of the wandering womb, survived until the early 1600s. when in fact these physicians found out that the uterus was pretty much tethered in place by ligaments and other supporting tissues, meaning that it never was able to move around. Now, while the thought of a floating uterus wandering around your body seems kind of silly to us now, at the time, it was the cutting edge of medical technology, and the physicians really were, I believe, doing the best that they could with the knowledge that they had. But for me, the takeaway from this historical look at this diagnosis of the wandering womb is that we still have remnants of these thoughts about women in our society and in our healthcare today. Although less frequent now, we still hear that women can't serve as the president of the United States or CEOs of big companies because of, hormones. And as far as healthcare goes, we are still very much dependent upon the male's look at the female's body, as only 34% of the doctors in the United States are women.
Wow.
The good news is we are making progress, but it does make me wonder, if I were a female physician at that time treating other female patients, if on the way home I would tell them they needed to stop by the pharmacy and pick up a big hot pile of steaming goat dung, or if I would have realized that having a uterus isn't a disease after all. I'm curious as to what your thoughts are with regard to the wandering womb and these diagnoses, and also how they affect what's happening today. If you like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos just like this one, then please make sure that you subscribe and share this video with other friends, family, and people who think that you're just weird anyway. I'll see you next time. Until then, let's go make some great history.